Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football to the Oregon fans who are rocking with the boys late Tuesday night as we previewed signing day. We said one thing, history tends to repeat itself, and history tells us that Dan Lanning and Oregon consistently have an ace up their sleeve. We just weren't really sure what that ace was going to be. I think it's pretty damn clear sitting here Thursday morning. It's five-star wide receiver Chris Henry Jr. Been a wild last 24 hours. At this time yesterday, he was supposed to sign his papers to Ohio State, the school that he was committed to since the summer of 2023. He wakes up yesterday morning, gets the news that wide receivers coach Brian Hartline leaving Ohio State, going to USF, but it wasn't only the news of him leaving. It was the lack of communication from Ohio State to Chris Henry Jr. It sounds like Chris Henry Jr. was legitimately surprised that Brian Hartline was leaving the morning he was supposed to sign his papers. Doesn't sign yesterday. It sounds like it's between Oregon. We thought USC was going to be a player. Sounds like they're not going to be a player. Oregon, Ohio State, and a late push from Texas that sounds to be a significant NIL package. Where does Oregon sit? That's the first update I want to get into, but I also want to talk about some other commitments that Oregon landed that I think are some sneaky, intriguing ones that flew under the radar yesterday. Chris Henry Jr. kind of took up a lot of the airspace as we talked about Oregon on the recruiting trail. I will say this. Remember back in May when Jackson Cantwell committed to Miami, Jerry Curtis committed to Georgia. It seemed like Oregon struck out on their two most prioritized prospects in the 2026 class, and there was a lot of opposing fan bases. There was a lot of national media that was questioning Oregon on the recruiting trail. I think the Oregon fans who've been following Dan Lanning for the last couple of years weren't all that concerned. Where do we sit right now? Oregon pushing, man. Oregon's going to sign a top 3 class in the country, maybe even top 2, especially if they can get Chris Henry Jr. across the finish line. And the crazy part about Oregon's class is it's not a ton of guys, but the quality is insane. I was crunching the numbers this morning at 10 players in the top 100 nationally ranked. 10% of the top 100 players in the country at the high school ranks, they're going to be playing their football in Eugene, Oregon. That is an incredible number for Dan Lanning. The average player commit is a 93.29. We thought this might be the worst recruiting class that Dan Lanning has signed a couple of months ago. It is turning into maybe the best recruiting class that Dan Lanning has signed. Funny how those things work. And at this point, Dan Lanning has earned our blind trust. That Dan Lanning going to figure it out when it comes to talent acquisition. I want to start with Chris Henry Jr. because I have some takes regarding where this recruitment stands. I want to talk about a few other sneaky commitments that Oregon landed. Before we get into it, as always, to the Oregon fans, appreciate you guys, man. Y'all know how much fun I have talking this football team. The amount of support the Oregon fans continue to show the boys, amazing. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Man, vibe check in the comment section. How are we feeling about this recruitment? Do we think Chris Henry ends up as a Duck? Let it fly in the comment section. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, as it pertains to Chris Henry Jr., God, you got to have Oregon as the favorite. That's the intel that we're getting from the inside sources. The Steve Wilfongs and the Tom Lloyds who do a really damn good job keeping us informed on the recruiting trail. The way I look at it, to me, it feels like a no-brainer too, for a couple of different reasons. Number one, even with Texas coming in with a significant NIL package, you feel like Oregon's going to be pretty damn competitive on the NIL front. It might not be as much as Texas, but I can't imagine it be that much different, right? Number two, Oregon is the program. If he does not wind up at Ohio State, there's not a program across the country that Chris Henry Jr. has better relationships with than Dan Lanning in Oregon. Dan Lanning talked about it yesterday during his press conference, and I thought it was really cool. Like, what's it mean that Will Stein is now heading to Kentucky? Like, this is when having a head coach that is this tip of the spear when it comes to the recruiting efforts, it matters. There's a lot of other programs that if they lose a coordinator, they're losing commits. And that's not the case with Oregon because Dan Lanning takes such an active approach when it comes to building his recruiting classes. The relationships are there with Oregon and Chris Henry Jr., right? There's no program that has better relationships than Chris Henry than Oregon outside of Ohio State. So if it ain't Ohio State, Oregon's got the relationships. And then it comes to playing time. There's a little bit of a stigma, and I'm not sure many of the Oregon fans might know this because you might not follow Texas all that closely. There is a little bit of a stigma regarding Coach Sark trusting young wide receivers. Trusted Ryan Wingo a little bit in 2024. They had 2 5-star wide receivers on their roster this year that did not see the football field very often. And then you look at it from an Oregon standpoint and say, all right, DeCorian Moore is one of the best freshman wide receivers that we saw in the entire country. It was one of the biggest names in the sport. Now, if Chris Henry Jr. wants to play and get an opportunity as a freshman, you feel like what DeCorian Moore is doing at Oregon, certainly pushing Chris Henry Jr. to maybe become an Oregon Duck. And there is zero doubt in my mind Oregon is going to make this kid impossible to say no to. And what I mean by that is this is a skill set that they're missing in the wide receiver room. They got speed. They got playmaking ability. They got guys who can operate after the catch. They don't have a guy that looks like Chris Henry Jr. They have a guy like Kyle Casper, and Kyle Casper seemingly is not going to be a massive contributor for Oregon over the next couple of years, has dealt with a lot of injuries. If you're Dan Lanning, you're selling Chris Henry Jr. and hey, you're the missing piece. You're the missing skill set that we don't have in our wide receiver room. I think that matters too. When I look at it, it seems like Oregon has a lot of boxes checked. And as long as they can be competitive on the NIL front for Chris Henry and kind of match what Texas is doing, if it's not going to be Ohio State, I have a hard time seeing it being Texas over Oregon. I very well could be wrong, and I don't really know what the official numbers are in terms of the NIL packages being offered. We know Texas coming in with the significant offer. I guess what I'll say is this, that history has told us that very rarely does Oregon lose kids on the recruiting trail that they want due to finances. I think with that is a fair thing to say. It's happened. And Jackson Campbell going to Miami was certainly an example of that. It doesn't happen very often. 2 other commitments I want to talk about. And let's just update the Oregon's class real quick. Chris Henry Jr. kind of the last one. I won't take Deuce Gerald's off this list until he officially signs somewhere. If there was one guy I would hope Oregon surprises the country with, it would be Deuce Gerald's. Does not sound like that's going to happen. That's the position that if I'm Oregon, I'm looking at and saying that this is where we need to inject some talent, especially if Amari Washington and Bear Alexander head off to the NFL draft after this year. It's a really hard position to address in the portal. I think Deuce Gerald is a stud. We'll see what Oregon does. Let's talk about these 2 other guys. Trevon Watson coming from the JUCO ranks. You landed basically 2 nickel cornerbacks that have some versatility. Dan Lanning talked about in his press conference, look, when we are recruiting defensive backs, I'm trying to think about how he worded it. When we're recruiting defensive backs, we want versatility. It makes a lot of sense. When you think about it, Oregon is so freaking loaded when it comes to defensive back talent. If you want to get on the football field, we need guys that can do different things and play different positions. I look at Trevon Watson and say, played boundary cornerback at the JUCO ranks. I think would have an opportunity to maybe stay out on the boundary. Man, he could be a great nickel. And you could say the same thing with Azelle Benang. Now, these are 2 guys that are 3-star prospects, are not getting the same attention as Chris Henry Jr. And look, rightfully so, Chris Henry Jr. is the better prospect. 2 bone crunchers. I mean, guys that can be sticky in coverage, come up and support the run. I look at the value that Jaden Kennedy has brought to Oregon. Maybe one of the most underrated players in 2025 so far for the Ducks. When he came over from Ole Miss, I don't think a lot of us thought he was going to be a massive contributor. Ben nails at that nickel corner spot. He's been sticky in coverage. He's made some plays with the football in the air. He is consistently getting involved supporting the run. we don't talk about that nickel position like we talk about the boundary cornerback position. Like Brandon Finney gets more national media attention than a guy like Jaden Kennedy. Don't understate the value that Jaden Kennedy has brought at nickel. These two guys could be future nickel defenders for Oregon, but both of them provide different sort of value. Both could be boundary cornerbacks, and quite frankly, both could be safeties too. They could play all 5 positions in the back end. I don't think it's going to be next year. Hell, it might not be in 2027 either. These guys could eventually become good players. And that's the one thing I'll say about Oregon. They don't take guys that they don't have a vision for. If there's one thing that's very clear about Oregon is that we're not going to fill our high school recruiting classes up with a bunch of fluff. We are not recruiting the high school ranks to win PR battles. We're grabbing guys that we think have futures with this program that can provide value at different spots. I think those two kids do. We'll see how it plays out. Chris Henry Jr., not really sure when it's going to happen, but if it does, we'll certainly talk about it. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.